My name is Ren Castellano. I'm 35 years old. I run a licensed raptor rehabilitation center in rural Idaho. And last year, my own cousin, who helped manage our facility's outreach program, forged federal wildlife transport permits to illegally sell three of our non-releasable rare falcons to private overseas buyers. Falcons I had spent years rehabilitating and permanently caring for under strict federal protection. I want to show you the exact moment a Fish and Wildlife Service investigator confirmed the permits had never actually been issued. But first you need to understand what these birds meant to me and why losing them felt like losing family members with feathers. Picture this. A Fish and Wildlife Service field office in Boise, October 2025. An investigator sliding a printed transport permit across the table showing a federal permit number that, according to the agency's own database, had never been assigned to any application at all. That's where this ends. Let me walk you through how we got there. If you're watching, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment, and anyone who has cared for an animal that depends entirely on you for survival will understand exactly what this cost me. I want to take you back to how I found this work in the first place, because I think it matters to understanding why losing those three birds felt like losing something closer to family than property. I grew up on a small ranch outside Twin Falls, the kind of place where injured wildlife showed up on your porch with some regularity. And I remember at 11 years old, finding a red-tailed hawk with a broken wing in our barn, calling every number in the phone book until I finally reached a woman 2 hours away who ran an unlicensed rescue out of her own backyard. She let me visit that hawk every weekend for the 3 months it took to heal. And something about watching a creature that powerful reduced to complete dependence on human care, and then slowly, carefully, restored, reshaped the entire direction of my life before I'd even finished middle school. I've worked in raptor rehabilitation since I was 19, first as a volunteer at that same woman's expanding rescue, then earning my own federal and state permits through years of supervised training, building my own licensed facility in 2014 after a decade of learning under a mentor who taught me everything about caring for birds too injured to ever return to the wild. I remember the specific weight of receiving my own federal raptor permit for the first time, understanding, reading through the regulations line by line, exactly how seriously the law takes the protection of these species, and exactly how much responsibility that permit actually placed on me personally. Our center houses permanently disabled falcons, hawks, and owls under strict federal and state permits, birds that cannot legally be bought, sold, or transported without extensive documented authorization given their protected status under both the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and, for some of our residents, additional international protections given their species conservation status. We currently care for 22 birds, each with their own permanent injury, their own specific dietary and enrichment needs, their own personality that anyone who spends real time with raptors eventually learns to recognize, however much that surprises people who assume these birds are simply wild and unknowable. Among our residents was a peregrine falcon named Solstice, who arrived at our center in 2019 with a wing injury from a collision with a power line that left her permanently unable to achieve the sustained flight a wild peregrine needs to hunt successfully. Solstice had, over 6 years in our care, become something close to an ambassador for our entire program, calm enough around trained handlers to participate in educational programs, and I had personally handled her recovery from the very first week she arrived, weak and defensive, through years of rebuilding enough trust that she would eventually take food directly from my glove without hesitation. My cousin, Desmond, joined our small nonprofit in 2021 managing our public outreach and education programs, work that brought him into regular contact with our birds during school visits and fundraising events, though he had no role in their medical care or the federal permitting that governed their legal status. I brought him on partly out of family obligation since he'd struggled to find steady work after a series of jobs that never quite lasted, and partly because he genuinely had a gift for engaging school groups, making complicated conservation concepts accessible to 8-year-olds in a way that consistently impressed our program's biggest donors. For the first 2 years, Desmond performed this role well, and I remember feeling genuinely grateful that a family member had found something he was actually good at, something that mattered, after years of watching him drift between jobs that never seemed to fit him. The binary choice moment came in 2024 when Desmond, facing significant personal debt from a failed attempt at starting his own outdoor guiding business, approached me about a private collector overseas willing to pay substantial sums for rare falcons, an arrangement I refused outright, explaining that our non-releasable birds existed under federal protection specifically because they could never survive independently, and that selling them to a private collector, even a wealthy one who claimed to genuinely care about the species, was both illegal and a fundamental betrayal of the entire reason our center existed. I remember telling him plainly that these birds weren't inventory. That solstice specifically had taken 2 years just to trust me enough to step onto my glove without flinching, and that no amount of money could justify treating that kind of relationship as a transaction. If you've ever had someone treat a living creature's welfare as a negotiable financial opportunity, you understand exactly the disconnect I'm describing. Drop a comment if that's familiar. What I didn't know until later was that Desmond had continued pursuing the arrangement independently, spending months researching our own facility's legitimate federal permitting paperwork closely enough to reproduce its letterhead and permit number formatting convincingly, eventually producing forged federal transport permits for 3 of our falcons, including Solstice, and had arranged, through a network of contacts he'd apparently built over several months of quiet outreach, for the birds to be transported to overseas buyers willing to pay considerably more than any legitimate falconry transaction would ever command, given the birds' illegal, unpermitted status. I discovered this in September 2025, during a routine facility inventory I conduct monthly, when I found 3 enclosures empty and Desmond's account of their whereabouts inconsistent with our actual transport logs. I remember standing in front of Solstice's empty enclosure for a long moment, genuinely disoriented, running through every legitimate explanation I could think of before the actual shape of what had happened started to become clear. I contacted Fish and Wildlife Service directly that same afternoon, and their investigation, moving with a speed I hadn't fully expected given how seriously they treat wildlife trafficking cases, confirmed within 2 weeks that the transport permits Desmond had produced bore permit numbers that had never actually been issued by the agency at all. Simply invented numbers formatted to look plausible to anyone who didn't check them against the agency's own records. If you've ever discovered that a family member had trafficked something under your direct care and protection, you understand a very specific kind of grief. Tell me in the comments if you've experienced anything close to it. The federal investigation traced the birds to 2 buyers in the Middle East, part of a private collecting circuit that, investigators explained to me, has fueled a persistent illegal market for rare falcons for decades, driven by a small number of extremely wealthy collectors willing to pay enormous sums for birds regardless of their legal status. Through international wildlife enforcement cooperation between Fish and Wildlife Service and counterpart agencies overseas, all 3 falcons were recovered within 4 months. Though Solstice required significant veterinary care after the stress of illegal transport worsened her old wing injury, and she arrived home considerably thinner and more skittish than the confident bird I'd sent to what I believed, at the time, was simply a transfer to another accredited facility for a temporary breeding program consultation Desmond had fabricated as his cover story. We confronted Desmond in October 2025, with federal investigators present. His composure broke almost immediately. "The debt got worse than I ever told anyone," he said, his voice unsteady. "I told myself the birds couldn't be released anyway. So selling them to someone who genuinely cared for them wasn't really that different from keeping them here. And I convinced myself the permits were just a formality standing between the birds and buyers who actually wanted them badly enough to pay real money for that privilege." I asked him directly whether he'd understood, even at the time, what illegal transport actually does to a bird physically, the stress, the improper conditions collectors' transport networks are known to use to avoid detection. He was quiet for a long moment. "I told myself it would be fine," he said. "I didn't let myself think about it too closely, because thinking about it too closely would have meant admitting what I was actually doing." It wasn't a full accounting, but it was the first honest sentence he'd offered since this began. Desmond faces federal charges under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Lacey Act given the scale of the trafficking and forged federal documentation involved. Charges that carry the possibility of significant prison time given the deliberate, sustained nature of the scheme rather than any single impulsive act. Our facility implemented stricter internal controls separating outreach staff entirely from any access to permitting documentation going forward, along with a new protocol requiring any bird transfer, for any reason, to be independently verified directly with Fish and Wildlife Service before a single bird leaves our property. Solstice came home in January 2026, and I remember sitting with her that first night back, in a quiet room away from our other birds, watching her settle onto her perch slowly, warily, taking nearly an hour before she'd accept food from my glove the way she used to without hesitation. It took another 3 months of patient, careful work to rebuild the trust that had taken 2 years to establish in the first place, and I remember the exact afternoon she finally stepped onto my glove again without the small flinch she'd carried since her return, understanding in that moment how close we'd come to losing her permanently to a stranger who saw her as a possession rather than a creature who depended entirely on people actually protecting her. I think some mornings walking our facility at dawn before our first feeding round, about the cousin who used to light up explaining conservation concepts to a group of school children, genuinely good at a job that mattered, and how thoroughly financial desperation convinced him that the exact birds who depended most completely on our protection were an acceptable price to pay for solving his own debt. I think if you've made it this far, the thing worth remembering tonight is this. Creatures that depend entirely on your protection cannot simply be treated as assets by someone facing their own financial desperation. And the federal safeguards protecting vulnerable wildlife exist precisely because trust alone was never meant to be the only thing standing between a falcon and a buyer with enough money to want her badly enough to pay whatever it costs to look away from how she got there. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs it. I'll see you in the next one.